Welcome to EPG Pathshala Philosophy. We are discussing one of the modules in logic, in Indian logic, which is Carvaka's skepticism about Anumana Pramana. Ordinary life is largely dominated by self-experience. Okay? In daily life, we see objects in front of us. There are objects and we perceive objects. And that's what is called as perception. And we have a perception of objects. So there are three important elements here, that there is an object and there is a perceiver, and when the perceiver looks at the object, perception takes place. Okay, so that is one of the dominant aspects of human experience, or even that is what plays an important role in human knowledge. If this is clear, then there is a problem that comes at the edge of this domain, which is governed by perception. What is that edge? We move from the sense perception of the human being and objective reality that is in front of us to domains outside these. In other words, we do come across instances where we have experience or knowledge outside sense perception. We also have we also postulate objects outside what we see them. In other words, the outside of sense perception or outside of the objects pose a serious problem. But though it is a serious problem, that constitutes a very important aspect of our human existence. Take, for instance, that I see a table in front of me. Now, I perceive the table that is in front of me. This much is very clear. It should not create any problem till now. Was there a chair before I started perceiving it? If it was there, how do I ascertain its existence when I am not perceiving it? In other words, this is the problem of pre-existence of objects before I start perceiving them, before I have perception of them. The other important problem surrounding this domain is, does the chair cease to exist when I take my eyes away from it, or it continues to exist even when I take my eyes away from it? That's a problem of what can be considered as post-existence of the object after I cease to perceive it. There is a further problem of analyzing what is called as, when I look at an object, my knowledge of the object consists not only in knowing that it is an object called chair, but also knowing that it is not a table, it is not a coffee, it is not water, it is not several things. In other words, I perceive the object not what it is only, but also this knowledge constitutes of knowing what it is not, which is called as the non-existence of the object. Now, in order to ascertain pre-existence, post-existence and non-existence of an object which is in front of me, I cannot depend only on perception, because I am not perceiving before I started looking at the chair. I am not going to perceive after I leave this room where the chair is located. I will not be able to perceive what it is not. All these things depends on something other than perception. All these three important things depend upon what is called inference, which is non-perceptual mode of knowledge. Inference, in that sense, is an inevitable prerequisite for having ordinary experience. Inference is a prerequisite in ascertaining truth, in having knowledge, in having experience of an objective world. Now, the term used by Carvakas and other Indian philosophical schools for inference is Anumana. Let us discuss Anumana, which is inference, in Carvaka and in some other Indian philosophical schools. Inference that is necessary to make the pre-existence, post-existence or non-existence are not at all a problem for a philosophical school called Carvaka. They would grant, for instance, that yes, these are, in these cases, inference as a mode of knowledge may be required. But the problem of inference is a problem for Carvakas in a third mode of knowledge. Namely, there is a chair and I perceive it. There was a chair before I entered the room. I know it through inference. There will be a chair after I leave this room. I can infer it, and I can also infer what a chair is not. But the problem is with regard to a fourth dimension. And what is that fourth dimension? That fourth dimension is, I have a chair in front of me, and the chair is an artifact. Since it is an artifact, it has been created by someone, in this case, a carpenter. If carpenter is the creator of this chair, then there is a possibility where I have seen a carpenter making a chair, or I know a carpenter who made this chair. So, in principle, it is possible for me to know the creator or the manufacturer of this chair, the carpenter. That is not a problem for Carvakas. The problem comes in the next step. What is the next step? That when I ascertain the existence of a carpenter who has made this chair not through perception but through inference. Now, I have allowed, in addition to perception, an inference as a mode of valid knowledge or a valid source of knowledge in order to account for the carpenter who created this chair. Now, the inference acquires a legitimacy in ascertaining the truth of the creator of the chair. Now, leaving the example of the chair, one pushes the argument or justification for inference to allow the following instance. And what is that instance? That there is this world, like there is a chair. The world must have had a creator, like chair had its creator. Now, how do I ascertain the creator? Not through sense perception, not through perception. I ascertain the existence of a creator, in this case God, using the inference which is allowed in the case of chair and its creator, the carpenter. Okay. So the problem is that if you accept inference as a valid source of knowledge, then using the same gate, God enters. God as a creator enters. Now, God as a creator is not accepted because of the mystical experience, because of analogy or any other thing, but through inference. In other words, accepting inference tantamounts to accepting metaphysical entities such as God, soul, other worlds. Now, this is the serious problem for Carvakas. Carvakas have to take a call, a very strong call, to stop or to scuttle the possibility of the transcendental entities entering into the philosophical domain and having a justification. So there is a problem. The problem is Carvakas do not reject inference as a valid source of knowledge, not because they find there is intrinsically something wrong with the inference as a valid source of knowledge. Carvaka seems to be rejecting inference as a valid source of knowledge because accepting it tantamounts to accepting the transcendental entities. In other words, they seem to be painfully and bravely embracing reductionism, not because they find reductionism acceptable, but because reductionism seems to be inevitable. To recall, Carvakas do not reject Anumana as a Pramana dogmatically. They reject it as accepting it enables in establishing dogmas like God, soul, or other worlds. With this general background, let us look at some of the specific ideas and arguments about Anumana as a Pramana with special reference to Carvaka. Let us take, for example, often used argument that inferring the existence of fire on the mountain by virtue of the latter's possessing smoke, the inference assumes the form, the mountain is fiery as it has got smoke. So, there are three important things here. The inference, in this inference, the mountain is paksha, fire is sadhya, and smoke is hetu. Here, if you look at closely the argumentation, here the inference is through the rule of concomitance, or more specifically, invariable concomitance, vyapti, which is of the form, wherever there is smoke, there is fire. In other words, look at the nature of the argument. There is smoke smoke in the mountain, so there is a fire. That's a specific instance of inference. Now, you come to the another stage of the inference where there is a Vyapti is in operation, where you are making a generalization from the particular instances, and you are saying that wherever there is smoke, there is fire. This is a generalization, and this is a problem for Carvakas. Two things are involved here. One, fire is inferred from smoke, and this particular instance of inference is used to arrive at a larger claim, which is wherever there is a smoke, there is a fire. If you closely observe what is in operation in this mode of argumentation is, Vyapti is in operation, and Vyapti in the inference is the key factor, So let us look at the next part of the argument. The instance is, there are instances where Anumana Pramana can mislead. Let me now refer to Haribhadra Suri, who lived in 8th century. In his book Saddarshana Samuschaya, refers to a story, and the story is the following. This world loka consists of only as much as is within the scope of senses. What the vastly learned ones speak of as true is but similar to the statement, "Oh dear, look at the footprints of the wolf." That this is a story of a wife asking her husband to show her a wolf. And then the husband draws the footprints of the wolf on the sand and then tells his wife to see that the wolf has passed through this path. Okay, so now it is not that there is real wolf that passed through that passage. The footprints were man-made. So this is shown to be a misleading way of using Anumana to ascertain knowledge. Let us discuss the concrete philosophical reasons for rejecting Anumana as a source of knowledge. For instance, Buddhists accept two Pramanas. They accept perception and inference. But they go on to say something very interesting. They treat perception as primary and inference as secondary. Carvakas react to this discrimination of inference within the two Pramanas, perception and inference. They say that all Pramanas have to be primary. Since perception is considered by Buddhists as primary and inference is considered by Buddhists as secondary, the secondary status of inference as a Pramana tantamounts to rejecting, that is, their own rejecting inference as not a Pramana which is on par with perception. This thus cannot be accepted, according to Carvakas, as a valid source of knowledge. An oft-quoted statement of the Carvakas rejecting the authenticity Anumana runs as, since Pramana must be non-secondary and inference is secondary, it is very difficult to have ascertainment regarding an object through inference. Unquote. Another source of Carvaka's criticism of Anumana is available in Jayanta Bhatta's Nyayamanjari. There are various objections raised by Carvaka against the authenticity Anumana, and they are: 1. Charvakas present one of their major objections in the form of a dilemma, which is as follows. If the inference is made from particular Vishesha to particular, for example, from particular case of coexistence of smoke and fire seen in the kitchen to a new particular case, say mountain, where only smoke is seen, then the inference is not acceptable because no concomitance is established. If, on the other hand, the inference is not about a particular but a universal, samanya, that is, in the above case, the inference is about the fire universal and not the fire particular, then there will be the fallacy of what they call as proving the proved, because the universal fire is already proved in the kitchen. That is to say, the inference in this case will be superfluous. If it is argued that inference is neither about particular nor about universal, as mentioned in the above two instances, but about a particular characterized by a universal in the above case, it is about the particular fire characterized by fireness or particular mountain characterized by fire in general. Jan Charvakas say, in fact, a particular characterized by a universal is unacceptable. Therefore, Charvakas ask, how can one talk about Anumana as an authentic means to knowledge? That is, if in the inference the conclusion is not contained in the premise, then it cannot be valid. On the contrary, if the conclusion is not different from the premise, then it is empty and useless. So there is a vacillation between validity and usefulness. Sometimes it is argued that while the conclusion is not logically novel, but psychologically novel, as giving valid argument can be informative. Now, after we discussed this, we can move on to the arguments pointed out by Jayanta Bhatta against invariable concomitance. Jayanta Bhatta points out the main objection of Charvaka regarding Anumana is not about superfluity of inference, but about the truth of its premise. More specifically, it is not about the truth of all the premises, but about the truth of the particular premise which states the universal concomitance between probans and probandum. The philosophers who accept inference as a source of veridical cognition generally accept the form of inference in which there are at least two premises. One stating that the probans exist on the subject of inference, and the other stating the invariable concomitance between probans and probandum. According to Jayanta Bhatta, Charvakas raise a series of objections against the possibility of knowledge of Vyapti. Yet another objection about inference is, inference presupposes that there is uniformity of nature. This is a very important assumption made by those who justify inference, namely that there is uniformity in nature. But Charvakas question this basic proposition as they say things in nature are different from each other, and the difference is due to difference of space, difference of time, and difference of circumstances. Now, the important point made here is that if there is no uniformity, how do you arrive one from the other if one and other are heterogeneous and not uniform? If they are uniform, they can be derived. If they are not uniform, then they ask, how do you arrive something that is different from the other, the same thing. Therefore, they say it is not possible that there would be a present universal agreement. Hence, Carvaka's challenge the very existence of invariable concomitance. Further, they point out, granting that invariable concomitance exists, it is not possible, according to them, to ascertain them without the knowledge about the innumerable things that pervade the three worlds. In other words, it is not possible to enumerate all the instances of there being fire because there is a smoke. So, if you don't have all the instances verified, then how do you justify deriving all after you looked at only some particular few instances? This is their serious objection against inference. So, they maintain, so long as each and every individual smoke and individual fire present in the world have not been perceived, one may very well have a doubt about the validity of inference. So let us look at two important criticisms on two major assumptions presupposed by inference and those who justified inference. One, is the world uniform or non-uniform? If it is uniform, then you can have inference. You can infer one which is uniform with the other. That's possible. But if they are different, how can one be derived from the other? That's the one of the major point of the contest. The second one is, how do you arrive at a universal law of inference after looking only at some particular instances? Unless you look at all the instances, you cannot derive a universal law. We can also point out that it is not Carvaka alone who rejected Anumana as a valid source of knowledge. There are others who rejected Anumana as a valid source of knowledge. They consist of the grammarians and the non-dualist Vedantians. The grammarian Bhartrihari criticized in his Vakyapadiya Anumana as a Pramana. He says, I quote, when a blind person hurries on in an uneven path, mainly depending upon inferences by the touch of the hand, etc., he stumbles down, not infrequently, on the ground. So, Bhartrihari says, an object may be systematically inferred by one person in a particular way and having a particular nature, and the same object may be inferred by another person having a different nature. In other words, that an object can be inferred at one level of cognition by a person in a particular way and put it to a use. And another person can infer that very same object from a different level or a vantage point and put it to a different use. Now, there may not be a conflict between these two things, but there will be a problem in ascertaining which is a good inference and which is not a good inference. In addition to the grammarians, Shankaracharya, the Advaitian, in a section called Tarka Pratisthana, non-respectability of reasoning of Brahma Sutra, points out many intrinsic defects in Tarka, that is Anumana, as a means to knowledge. So even grammarians and Advaitins were critical of inference, though there is a difference between Charvaka's criticism and these other criticisms of Anumana. Charvakas criticize Anumana to highlight the importance of perception. On the other hand, those like Bhatrihari and Shankara criticize Anumana to establish the superiority of Shabda, particularly the testimony of Vedas. For these non-Charvaka critics of Anumana, they fear that Anumana can be used to challenge the truths conveyed by Vedas. So they point out the weakness of Anumana Pramana and assign a limited role to it, namely that of merely supporting Vedic insights by reason. Naturally, they expect that Anumana is acceptable if it is not contradicted by Vedic authority. The views of Charvaka, on the other hand, would be that verbal testimony, if at all it is a genuine candidate for Pramanahood, is an indirect means to knowledge. Hence, it is reducible to Anumana, so that no special treatment needs to be given to it. Charvakas would further say that all the objections against Anumana as Pramana would also be applicable against Shabda as Pramana. The other source for Charvaka's criticism of Anumana is in another compendium, namely Sarvadarshana Sangraha by Madhava Sayana that I referred to earlier. In the later works like Sarvadarshana Sangraha, we find a more sophisticated criticism of Anumana attributed to the Charvakas. The Charvakas in Sarvadarshana Sangraha argue that Vyapti is a kind of relation which is free from both types of extraneous adjuncts, certain and dubious. The mere existence of the invariable concomitance cannot be the cause of an inference until and unless it is known. An object, if unknown, cannot be causally connected with the other. Charvakas then refer to major pramanas and examine whether Vyapti can be ascertained with the help of any one of them. The first one is, can Vyapti be justified through internal perception? For instance, Vyapti cannot be ascertained, according to them, through perception, in which internal sense organs act as an instrument. The internal sense organ is always dependent on the external ones for revealing some external objects. Because of this dependency, Charvakas maintain that perception cannot justify Vyapti. So, they reject inference. Can inference justify Vyapti? According to them, inference cannot provide the cognition of Vyapti on account of the fact that the knowledge of Vyapti is the precondition for applying an inference. If the knowledge of Vyapti depends on an inference, the inference itself also will depend on the knowledge of Vyapti. Thus, the knowledge of Vyapti or inference can never be attained due to the defect of infinite regress. Verbal testimony fails to ascertain Vyapti because the import existing in a term known from the meaning of a particular word is understood through the auditory perception of the words, and this leads to infinite regress. That is, the knowledge of invariable concomitance or Vyapti depends on verbal testimony, which again depends on the knowledge of import. But the question lies that the knowledge of import depends on inference, which being dependent on the knowledge of Vyapti depends on verbal testimony. In this way, the defect of infinite regress cannot be avoided. And lastly, whether comparison can validate Vyapti. Another source of knowledge called Upamana or comparison fails to ascertain Vyapti due to the fact that this Pramana is meant for apprehending the relation between a word and its denotation. The relation in the form of import between words like Gavaya, an animal resembling cow, and the denotations cannot be known by other source of valid cognition than comparison. Hence, the relation in the form of Vyapti between probans and probandum cannot be known by comparison. In the case of Vyapti, between two objects, there is a relation that is completely different from that of Samjna and Sagni, and hence comparison has no scope for apprehending it. Now let us look at argument from non-cognition of Upadhi. According to some, Vyapti is a relation free from extraneous adjunct or Upadhi. If it is accepted, the knowledge of the absence of extraneous adjunct is highly essential. Depending on the foregoing arguments, the Carvakas of Sarvadarshana Sangraha concludes that the knowledge of Vyapti cannot be attained through perception, through inference, through verbal testimony or comparison, leading to the impossibility of inference as a veridical cognition. Now, let us take, in conclusion, let us look at two important aspects of inference in relation to Carvakas. First is that Carvakas do not reject inference as a Pramana because inference is intrinsically defective. They reject it because accepting inference tantamounts to accepting transcendental realities such as God, soul, and the other world. That is, they do accept the utility of inference in day-to-day life. However, this does not allow them to accept it as a valid source of knowledge because of the threat from transcendental realities. In other words, the questions that we could ask are the following. One, if there was no threat of accepting the transcendental realities like God, soul, or the other worlds, what would be the position of Carvakas with regard to inference? That is one thing that one can think aloud and further extend the Carvakas' positions in the modern world. And two, if we followed Carvakas and highlighted the importance of perception, what would be the course of development of India in relation to positive sciences, natural sciences, the empirical world? Because if you accept inference, then that would legitimize transcendental realities and divert our attention towards the otherworldly. Okay, Carvaka seems to be alerting of the danger of the tendency and bringing to our attention that there is a need to focus on this world, and as a epistemological requirement for accepting that and taking that focus to further domains, you need to reject at the outset inference, not because inference is bad per se, but because of the consequences that it generates. So, this is the second point that we can think aloud. The third point that we should think aloud by way of a criticism on Carvaka is that one of the important points of inference is the present generation learning from the previous generation, not through experience but through inference. In other words, I understand my childhood from the experience of my previous generation, my parents or my grandparents. Now, I will that knowledge through inference from the previous generation add to, either in a positive way or in a negative way, to my perception of my childhood, of myself, my experience. I think it is in this dimension the inference can be revisited to see not merely the possibility of allowing transcendental entities, but how rejecting inference can deny us of this possibility of learning from others, from their experience inferentially. I hope you got the broad gist of Carvaka's views on inference, and you can read books listed in the module to get more information and more arguments and get a better idea of this on this topic. Thank you.